if I'm being honest, that's a scripture that kind of makes me go, oof. But we here at Heston Mennonite think the Bible is an important thing. We just handed out Bibles to 1st and 7th graders. And we have to then look, if we think the Bible is important, look at all of it, even the messy parts that make us uncomfortable. So we're going to do that today. But hopefully we can find something in this text that, even though it's maybe not written the way that we would want it to be, that it is important for us, and there's a reason why it is in our Bible. Now, there's a commercial out there, or a set of commercials out there, put out by an insurance company that will remain nameless. And they say, we can't stop you from becoming your parents, but we can protect your home and auto when you bundle with us. Now, in these commercials, I think it's really creative. They have this Dr. Rick character who is a life coach in parentology. And he helps people who are becoming to be more and more like their parents after they buy their first home. You know, silly things like offering unsolicited advice in the stores, or too many throw pillows on the couch, or perhaps not using the mute switch or button on your phone. Anybody forget to do that? You can do that now. I think this is a clever commercial, because it's a play on one of our fears, or one of the things that makes us just go, ugh, inside. But the reality is we do inherit certain things from our parents. For instance, like my mother, I always cook far too much rice or pasta to go with whatever is supposed to go on top of that. There's always way out of proportion. No matter what I do, it's always out of proportion. Like my dad and my grandpa before him, we have a thing for mixed nuts. Just you pour yourself a bowl of mixed nuts as a snack and just snack on it almost all day. I would probably do that if I kept them around. So, you know, we pick up little things from our parents, and we don't tend to worry about the good traits, the good things like hospitality or generosity or compassion. But we may be a little off-put by some of the things that maybe we were embarrassed by as kids, or the things that made us, or just bothered us in what we were doing. Or maybe it's just kind of that reality check that we are getting older. Nobody wants to think that. So as we think about this specific text, I'm just going to say what probably a lot of us are thinking, or have thought at some point. Genesis is kind of weird. As we look through Genesis, we encounter or read a lot of strange stories that feel off-putting. If we think too hard about even the story of Noah, which is often one that we use in children's decorations or books, we realize that there's a darkness to that story that we don't often talk about. But these stories are here for a reason. So we have to ask ourselves, why are they here? If we think about this story that we just heard, that Kay just read, I recognize that God was not even mentioned once in that whole story. So this piece can't be directly, at least, about who God is. And in a lot of ways, it's definitely not a story that we would want to live out in our lives. Some stories in the Bible we read and we're supposed to say, okay, I want to make my life more like that. It's an inspirational story in that way. This one, I think, is one of those stories, kind of like what Jess was talking about last Sunday, is one of those stories of what not to do, or a warning of what happens when you are like this. And we really need to pay attention to those stories just as much as the ones that show us what to do, because they have a really important message. Now, I do want to say just very briefly that we must be careful not to impose our morality or our idea of what is right and wrong onto some of these ancient texts. they functioned very differently in their time than we did. And that there are things in here that we don't want to be too judgmental over of the characters in there, but we also don't want to use this text to say it's okay to treat women like property, or it's okay to have these very strange love triangles. Probably want to avoid those. And then, I have to be honest, as I was looking at the family tree of this family, it was a lot different than the family tree I would aspire towards. And we just have to let some of those things go. Because if we get stuck in that place, we're going to get distracted by the ways that we want this text to be speaking and miss what it is actually speaking to us. So let's set that aside, and let's try to recover some of this original meaning. Let's search for clues on what it could be. So in this general section of Genesis, just to give you a little context, we see a lot being talked about that has to do with the genealogy of people, of this father had these sons and daughters, and then had these sons and daughters, and it follows along, and it's all kind of laid out in this section. And this is one of those places where the story gets kind of expanded, not just saying, doot, doot, doot. It's kind of saying, this is the father, and then this all happened. And we see that just before Jacob enters into this new land, that he's actually told to go there by his father, to go to Padam Aram, which is modern-day northern Syria. So if you think of where Israel is, and then where Syria is, that's quite a journey. So he's sent pretty far. And he was told to find a wife among his kin there, among those of Rebekah's family, his mother's family. Another clue is found in this idea that Rachel is tending the sheep. While a female shepherd was uncommon in this time, it was not unheard of, especially if a father had no sons. Somebody had to tend the sheep, right? But it was also a way that a woman could meet a husband. So we have on Jacob's side him being told by his father to go and meet someone to marry. And Rachel is kind of sent out as a shepherdess to meet her future husband. So I think this is a good example of some early long-distance matchmaking going on. There's also another clue here in the description of the daughters of Laban, of Leah and Rachel. The Message version writes it like this: Leah had nice eyes, but Rachel was stunningly beautiful. And it's just come to my attention recently that whenever you see these sort of contrasts in the Bible, you can probably bet that there's some sort of conflict or competition being set up. And it's also interesting that there's an older and younger in this story, and we're in the middle of the story of Jacob, who Jacob and his brother Esau the older, Jacob the younger, had this sort of battle for who would be the blessed son. So we have kind of these two contrasts going on. So we can see that this story is trying to push us to see what's going on in these families, and maybe to ask the question, why is this happening? I think we can safely say that this story is telling us of how the generations came together and how these families came to be. But when we look at that actual how, that we see that when humans intervene to take over what God has been trying to do, it makes a pretty big mess. So, as I said, I kind of was looking at the family tree and then decided it was more of a web than a tree. If you're looking on your screen, on the screen right now, it kind of folds in on itself a little bit. But I'm not going to get into genetics. I want to talk about family history of attitudes and behaviors. And what I see is a lot of lying and cheating. So if you think of Abraham and Sarah, who would be grandfather to Jacob, grandfather and grandmother to Jacob, they are caught multiple times in lies. And it becomes huge problems. And then they try to manufacture an heir rather than doing it the way that God had intended. They used a maidservant to create an heir, and that caused a whole pile more problems. If you look further down, Rebecca, who marries into that family, she really is the one behind a lot of the stuff that Jacob is doing. She's the one that's orchestrating this deception that's going on. And in a lot of ways, she's the mother of Jacob and Esau, and she chooses to pit them against each other. She chooses to maybe take this vision that one son will be over the other and makes that happen through deception and through lies. Then, in our story today, we see Laban, who is brother to Rebekah, that he tries to pull a fast one on Jacob. And, Jacob, pay a little more attention, please. But we see again and again that this family has this history of lies and deception. But will this continue? Could this stop with Jacob? I think yes, it could, but spoiler alert, it doesn't. And next week, you'll find out more about that. Jess is preaching the story that comes right after this one, and we'll see how it repeats a bit. But the reality is there's this conflict that continues to go on. Even at the end of this story, one of the last things that is said in this story is that he, Jacob, loved Rachel more than Leah. And that is going to play out in a lot of crazy ways. But I don't think this story is there to tell us that we are doomed to repeat history. I think it's there to tell us that there is hope. And especially in Jesus, there is hope for something new to happen. That we are not bound by our family tree or family web in this case, but that perhaps we can find a new way. So back to Dr. Rick from those commercials, doing the parentology. Maybe I'm going to try a little parentology of my own and help us to try and find ways that we can overcome some of this baggage, shall we call it, in our family, and shake up the family tree. I've got 3 suggestions here. First, parents or adults set the tone. I'm going to use a story to illustrate this a bit. So these 2 boys in this picture are my nephews, the sons of my good friends who are like family to me. And we swapped houses. Phil and Mary went to my place, and I went to their place, and I had the kids for a weekend. It was mostly fun. No, we had a good time. It's different, right? And change is hard. But one of the things that I appreciated that when we went to the zoo, which is where this picture was taken, I handed the boys their masks, and they put them on right away. No complaining. They even liked to wear it. Ethan, when I took him to school on Monday, he put on his mask while in the van. And he's like, I like wearing it. Why? Why wouldn't I? But I think this is because his parents set the tone. And me, by wearing a mask, set the tone for how that would work. And I think those of you in elementary school education, you've seen that too. When we model something as adults, and especially as parents, kids catch on. It's not a guarantee, but it's interesting to see how children can pick up on things and respond. I think if we want something better for the next generation than what we have for ourselves, we have to be willing to do this. And it might require sacrifice, but I guarantee you it is worth it. As someone who has participated in many, many funerals, the stories that I hear there can be quite beautiful as we hear about people who are humble, who are compassionate, who are generous and hospitable almost to a fault. And so maybe one of the things that we can ask of ourselves to break these cycles of dysfunction is, what do I want people to talk about at my funeral? Okay, I know this is a little dark, but spoiler alert, we're all going to have a funeral. And so think about it. How do I want to be remembered? What is the story I want to have people tell about me? And then ask yourself, well, what would it take to get there? Do I need to be willing to host people in my backyard? Because in this time of COVID, that's probably the better choice. Am I willing to say, you know what, I'm going to get a little cold so that I can be in fellowship with other believers? Or fellowship with my neighbors who aren't believers? What will it take to get us there? The second thing, and this comes pretty much directly from this story and the ones before it, give up the lying and the scheming. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but because I'm sure none of you have done this, but when you lie and you get caught in that lie, everything gets so much worse, right? It kind of cascades like a snowball rolling down a hill. It gets bigger and bigger. This is what happens, but it can happen generationally. And in Proverbs 11, there's this pair of verses that I think really highlight this. It says, "The righteousness of the blameless makes their path straight, but the wicked are brought down by their own wickedness. The righteousness of the upright delivers them, but the unfaithful are trapped by their evil desires." We need to give up this desire to control the narrative, to control the things through lying and deception. In this passage, this word righteousness, tzedakah, in Hebrew, means living a virtuous life. A life of integrity, a life of justice, a life that is above reproach. So I think this verse and even this story are calling us to embody that. We got to give up the lying and the scheming. We got to embrace honesty and a willingness to admit when we're wrong. So many lies are told to cover up when we've messed up. And yet, if we only admitted we were wrong and moved on past there, how much more integrity would you have? How much more trustworthy would you be? I think honesty can go a long way, as could waiting for God's provision rather than trying to control the outcome ourselves. Third thing, make faith a priority. I often go back to this headline that I saw several years ago from the Babylon Bee. And if you're not aware, the Babylon Bee is kind of a satire website. I don't agree with everything that's there, but this one article I thought was perfect. It was entitled, "After 12 years of quarterly attendance, parents shocked by daughter's lack of faith." In the article, which is obviously made up, it talks about how this family would go to church basically whenever the soccer game was rained out or the volleyball game was canceled. That this family only really connected with faith when it was convenient. And that they were surprised then that their children didn't follow in their footsteps of faith. Now I realize that it looks different these days, but it doesn't have to. And I think this is not just for families, this is for individuals as well. If we don't make faith a priority, it won't be. If we don't make faith a priority, we're not going to grow in our relationship with God. We're not going to know how God is calling us. We're not going to see change happen in our lives. We can speak all the wonderful things. We can try to be a good person. But ultimately, we will struggle. Because when we are disconnected from God and from our faith community, it just doesn't work out. So, I offer this suggestion. Find ways to connect with God and other followers of Jesus. Okay, that was pretty easy. Just find them. Whether it's talking to your neighbors about your faith and about their faith, whether it's spending a certain amount of time reading your Bible. A couple weeks ago, I met with some of our MYF and we talked about fasting and feasting. And many of them chose to fast from some aspect of social media or their phone. And I joined them in that and have been spending more and more time listening to or reading the Bible and praying as a result. And I think if teenagers can do it, if teenagers can say no to this little thing, every one of us here can too. Make faith a priority. These are just a few ways that we can change the narrative and break cycles of dysfunction. I'm not saying it's easy. It's not 3 easy steps. It's just 3 ways to do it. And to be honest, there may be times when we need professional assistance. We may need to seek a counselor, a spiritual director, a mentor to help us through that. And that's nothing to be ashamed of. When you break your leg, when you get sick, you go to a doctor. When your psyche or your spirit is sick, you go to a therapist or a spiritual director or a mentor. And again, this is not something that we only do in our biological families, or biofamilies as I like to call them, but it's something that we do within our church family. That we need to do these 3 things and probably more so that we can grow as a church family and as a community. This is why in our sort of church family, I feel it's important to speak and work against things like racism and sexism. Because I believe that the good news of Jesus is that we can be part of changing the narrative in our culture for the next generation as we live out these things. As we choose not to perpetuate the ways of the past, the ways that condemn or control others. We can do better. And the next generation deserves better. This is why I also prioritize things like education, good education, and critical thinking. Because we are in an age not of just information, we are in an age of disinformation. And I think some of the best bets in our culture moving forward is to have people who are not just informed, but those who are able to tap into the wisdom of God and the wisdom of truth. And this is why I also concern myself with socioeconomic inequality in our world. Because if Jesus, in the Gospels, invited the poor, the lame, and the lonely to his table, and tells the rich to consider abandoning their idol of wealth, then I think I should too, and we should too. None of us has control over the whole world. And that's not my goal in talking about this. We have control over our lives, perhaps our family's lives, if you have one, or maybe your chosen family, some control anyway, and maybe our sphere of influence. These are places where we can work to change the story, that we can abandon the dysfunction, that we can embrace new ways of living. So I leave you with these two questions. Will we choose to continue in the dysfunction, or will we find ways to bring out the best in our family and our church heritage? And question number 2, will we choose to take on the ways of our heavenly parent? I hope so. Amen.